Imagine building a product so successful that your employer sells 5 machines at a trade show before you've even figured out how you're going to build them all. Imagine proving that your idea worked. Imagine selling that idea to your employer and watching that product become one of the company's strongest performers. Imagine believing you've earned credibility, maybe even influence. Then imagine walking into a meeting with the next generation of that product, a cleaner, smarter, more environmentally responsible version, and being convinced everyone will see what you see. And then your boss dismisses it with one word, one syllable, 4 letters, and it begins with the letter F. No, not that word, a worse word. At least it felt worse to me in that moment. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't angry, it wasn't even dramatic. That might have been easier to understand. The word was quiet, dismissive, condescending. It was the kind of word that sounds harmless to everyone else in the room, but lands like a door slamming shut in your face when it's aimed at you. That one word hit me hard. And strangely enough, that one word started my company. Welcome back to Lessons from a Reluctant Entrepreneur, a series based on anecdotes from my book, The Reluctant Entrepreneur, Anatomy of a Business Startup from Uncertainty to Unstoppable. In the last episode, we talked about risk versus reward. We talked about the strange way entrepreneurs can risk dollars for the chance to make pennies, and how a bet like that would look ridiculous in Las Vegas, could look somehow courageous in a conference room. Today, I want to talk about the catalyst, because most entrepreneurs can point to a moment. Maybe not the entire plan, maybe not the finished business model, maybe not the spreadsheet or the bank loan or the first customer, but a moment, a trigger, a shove, a decision point. For me, that moment was a word, one single word. Now, to understand why that word mattered so much, we need to back up. Before I started my company, I worked for an electronics equipment manufacturer. I ran the company almost as if it were my own, except it wasn't my own, and that distinction matters. I cared deeply about the business. I cared about the products. I cared about the customers. I cared about where the industry was going. And because I cared, I had ideas. One of those ideas came up at a time when the electronics industry was facing a major environmental challenge. Certain chemicals widely used in our industry were being phased out because of their impact on the ozone layer. Once released, chlorine molecules from these chemicals could rise up into the upper atmosphere and contribute to ozone depletion. That was the original problem. It was the what goes up the stack problem. To me, the problem was obvious. Instead of fighting the regulation, instead of looking for another chemical that might eventually create another environmental issue, why not build a machine that avoided ozone-depleting chemicals and other harsh chemicals altogether? That idea became the first-generation machine. At first, my boss wasn't interested in the concept, so I sweetened the pot. I made him a different proposal. I told him I'd fund the project myself. No company money, no company resources. I'd work on my own time with my own money and my own risk. If it worked out, the company could buy it from me. If it failed, it was my problem. That must have sounded like a pretty good deal to him. All upside, no downside. So obviously, he agreed. And then came the question every entrepreneur eventually faces. Now what? It's funny how often we fight to get permission for something and then panic the moment we get it. I had clearance to move forward, but I didn't have all the skills I needed. Some were rusty, some were missing completely. So I called a childhood friend. He was one of those brilliant people who could understand almost anything technical, and together we designed and built the machine. And it worked. Actually, it worked better than expected. The first-generation machine solved the problem we'd set out to solve. It avoided the use of ozone-depleting chemicals and gave the industry a way to address the what goes up the stack issue. There happened to be a major trade show coming up, and I convinced my boss to let us show the machine at that trade show. During the 3-day trade show, we took orders for 5 machines. That was good news and bad news. The good news was we sold 5 machines. The bad news was we sold 5 machines, and now we had to build them. That's another entrepreneurial lesson hiding in plain sight. Sometimes getting what you want creates the next problem. Selling is exciting. Delivering is where reality shows up and takes no hostages. We built the machines wherever and however we could, including at the Northern California location of my friend's employer. But we both had day jobs. As more orders came in, it became increasingly obvious we couldn't consistently fulfill them in a timely way. We had created a product the industry wanted, but we didn't have the structure to build it properly. So, reluctantly, I made another proposal to my boss. I offered to sell the product, the design, and all the manufacturing rights to my employer for the equivalent of my out-of-pocket expenses. This time, he accepted quickly. The product now belonged to the company, and I believed that meant something. I believed I had raised my stature. I believed I had proven myself. I believed I had saved the company, or at least that's what my ego told me. And when your ego starts writing press releases in your head, watch out. Mine certainly did. The product became very successful. In fact, it was selling more units than all the other products in the company's lineup. So when the next annual product design meeting came along, I walked in with confidence, maybe too much confidence. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss ideas for future products. I came prepared with what I believed was the next generation of the machine I had originally designed. This is the part that matters. My boss had already accepted the first generation machine. He had already seen it work. He had already purchased the design. The ozone-depleting chemical issue wasn't what he was turning down at this meeting. That problem had already been addressed by the original product. What I was proposing now was the next environmental step. Once we solved what was going up the stack, I became concerned about what was going down the drain. The first generation machine avoided ozone-depleting chemicals, but it still had a drain. Effluent from the process went down that drain. And in my mind, it was only a matter of time before local regulatory agencies began paying closer attention to wastewater discharge. The industry had already been forced to address emissions. It seemed logical to me that wastewater would be next. So my new concept was completely zero discharge. No drain, no process effluent going down the drain, no customers worrying about what local regulators might eventually say about what was leaving the machine. The idea was to eliminate the problem before it became the next problem. That mattered to me. It mattered because environmental responsibility had been the driver from the beginning. The first generation machine helped customers avoid ozone-depleting chemicals. The next generation of the machine would go further by eliminating the drain and reducing or potentially eliminating a customer's exposure to wastewater-related regulatory scrutiny. So to me, the next logical step was very obvious. If the first generation solved what went up the stack, the next generation would solve what went down the drain. The new design would also include advanced data logging capabilities. User would be able to track valuable process data, document what happened during the cleaning cycle, and better understand the relationship between process control, cleanliness, and ultimately reliability. In other words, this wasn't just a new box with a few new features. It was cleaner, it was smarter, it was more environmentally responsible. It was zero discharge. It produced valuable process data, and it anticipated what I believe would become the next regulatory concern for our customers. That was the idea my boss turned down. And to me, it felt like he wasn't just rejecting another product concept. He was rejecting the future. There also was another idea being presented. I didn't pay much attention to it. That was probably my first mistake. I was so convinced my idea was right that I barely entertained the possibility that someone else might see things differently. I had already decided the outcome in my head. The room just hadn't caught up yet. Then my boss rejected the idea. He chose the other one. I was stunned. I remember feeling like I'd been sucker punched. I had already proven myself once. I had already developed a successful product. I had already created something that was outselling the company's other products. And now I was presenting what I believe was the next logical generation of that success. More environmentally responsible, zero discharge, nothing going down the drain, advanced data logging, better process control, a stronger answer to where I believed the industry was headed. How could they not see this? The only words I could get out were, "I believe you're making a mistake." And my boss responded with one word. What was that one word? Fine. That was it. Fine. The word I teased earlier, one syllable, 4 letters, beginning with F, and somehow worse than probably the word you were thinking. At least it was worse to me in that moment. It was such a small word, 4 letters, 1 syllable, but in that moment it carried a tremendous amount of weight. It wasn't just the word, it was the tone, dismissive, condescending, final. That word landed somewhere deep. It didn't feel like a normal business disagreement. It felt like a rejection. It felt like disrespect. It felt like the company I had treated as if it were my own was reminding me that it wasn't mine at all. And of course, that was true. It wasn't mine. Every decision I made was backed with someone else's money. Every idea I had still required someone else's approval. Every product direction, every investment, every risk still belonged to someone else. That realization hurt, but it also clarified something. If I believed in the idea so much, maybe I needed to stop trying to convince someone else to build it. Maybe I needed to build it myself. Now, let's be honest here. That wasn't a calm, well-balanced business decision at first. I'd love to say I went home, reviewed market research, built a financial model, studied competitive positioning, formed an advisory board, and carefully evaluated the opportunity. That's not what happened. What happened was much more human. I was angry. I was pissed off. I was embarrassed. I was offended. My ego was bruised, and I wanted to prove him wrong. I really wanted to prove him wrong. Those aren't always the healthiest reasons to start a business, but they're powerful reasons. Sometimes a business begins with inspiration. Sometimes it begins with opportunity. Sometimes it begins with purpose. And sometimes, like in my case, it begins because someone says fine in the wrong tone of voice. That was my catalyst. Fine became a mantra. Fine, I'll build it myself. Fine, I'll take the risk. Fine, I'll leave. Fine, I'll create an alternate reality where no one can dismiss my idea that way again. Of course, the last part was quite naive. I thought starting my own company would protect me from hearing the word no. I thought if I owned the company, I could avoid being dismissed. I thought entrepreneurship would give me control. What I didn't realize was that I was about to hear no more times than ever. Banks would say no, customers would say no, vendors would say no, attorneys would say no, cash flow would say no, the market would say no, and sometimes reality itself would say no. But at the time, I didn't know that. And maybe that's a good thing. As we talked about in the last episode, entrepreneurs don't always see risk clearly at the beginning. We often see the reward. We see the possibility. We see the product. We see the problem we can solve. We see the future we believe should exist. That's what I saw. I saw a product that needed to exist. I saw an industry moving in a direction I believed I understood. I saw an opportunity my employer rejected. And I saw myself as the person who could bring it to life. Was that confidence? Yes. Was it arrogance? Probably. Was it necessary? Maybe. That's one of the complicated things about entrepreneurship. The same traits that can get you into trouble can also get you moving. Anger isn't a great long-term business strategy, but it can start an engine. Ego isn't a great leadership model, but it can push you through the first wall. Ignorance isn't something to celebrate, but sometimes not fully understanding the difficulty is the only reason you begin. I needed something to move me. That word did it. But here's the part I understand better now. The word fine didn't really create the company by itself. It exposed something that was already there. I already had the product idea. I already had the desire to build something. I already had the frustration of working inside someone else's limits. I already had the belief that I saw something others didn't. I already had the need to prove something. Fine simply lit the fuse. That's how catalysts work. A catalyst doesn't always create the ingredients. It creates the reaction. And in that moment, the reaction began. Not instantly. I didn't walk out of that meeting and start a company that afternoon. Real life is quite a bit messier than that. I still had to plan. I still had to design. I still had to figure out what the product would become. I still had to convert my garage into a workshop. I still had to face funding problems. I still had to resign. And soon I would have to deal with fear, lawsuits, cash shortages, and everything else that came later. But emotionally, the journey started there. That one word marked the moment when I stopped seeing the company as the place where my future would happen. My future would have to happen somewhere else, and that somewhere else didn't exist yet. I would have to build it. That's a strange place to stand. You know you need to move, but you don't know exactly where you're going. You know the current path no longer fits, but the next path is still imaginary. You're somewhere between resentment and possibility, between anger and vision, between rejection and creation. That's where many entrepreneurs begin, not with certainty, with tension. Something doesn't fit anymore. A door closes, an idea is rejected, a job ends, a customer asks for something nobody offers, a boss says the wrong thing, a market changes, a frustration grows until it becomes fuel. And suddenly, the person who never planned to become an entrepreneur starts thinking, maybe I should do this myself. That moment deserves respect, but it also deserves caution, because not every rejection should become a company. Not every insult should become a business plan. Not every bruised ego should sign a lease. That's important. A catalyst can move something, but it shouldn't be the only thing guiding the journey. Anger can get you out of the door, but it can't tell you how to build a sustainable company. Ego can help you withstand rejection, but it won't teach you cash flow. Passion can help you begin, but it won't replace discipline. I learned all of that later, much later. At the beginning, I just knew I couldn't stay where I was. And sometimes that's the first honest step. You don't always know exactly where the next chapter will be. You only know the current chapter has ended. That's what fine did for me. It ended one chapter and began another. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that word. I certainly wasn't grateful at the time. At the time, I was mad, but with perspective, I can see it differently. That word forced a decision I may have avoided. It pushed me out of the comfortable frustration of wanting someone else to believe in my idea. It forced me to ask whether I believed in it enough to risk something myself. That's a very powerful question. Do you believe in your idea enough to risk your own comfort? Do you believe in it enough to face rejection? Do you believe in it enough to hear no again and again? Do you believe in it enough to keep going when the first version doesn't work? Do you believe in it enough to learn everything you don't yet know? Those questions don't need to be answered with slogans. They need to be answered with action. In my case, action began in the garage, but the emotional starting point was that meeting, that word, fine. And that's why I call this episode The Word That Started the Company, because one word can reveal the truth that you're done asking permission, the truth that someone else's rejection doesn't necessarily mean your idea is wrong, the truth that the thing you're waiting for may never be handed to you, the truth that if the product is going to exist, if the opportunity is going to be pursued, if the vision is going to become real, then maybe you're the one who has to build it. That doesn't mean it'll be easy. It won't. That doesn't mean everyone will understand. They won't. That doesn't mean the decision will be clean, rational, or free from fear. It won't be. But sometimes the beginning of a company isn't a grand opening. It's not a ribbon cutting. It's not a logo. It's not a website. It's not a business card. Sometimes the beginning is a quiet moment when something inside you says, I can't keep doing this the same way. For me, that moment sounded like one word, fine. That's the third lesson in The Reluctant Entrepreneur. Every entrepreneurial journey has a catalyst. Mine was a dismissive four-letter word that made me angry enough, arrogant enough, and motivated enough to stop asking someone else to believe in my idea and start building it myself. In the next episode of Lessons from a Reluctant Entrepreneur, we'll talk about what happened after the decision was made. Because starting a company doesn't mean you're ready. It means you're committed. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you again next week for the next episode.